In the 18th century, we have two different styles of performance, and it started out in the 18th century that there was a fixed pattern of diction, no real characterization, and they tended to be static and declaimed. And just to remind you, static means that the actors didn't move very much, and declaimed means that it's big and booming and loud. This is also known as the stand and deliver, in inverted commas, style of acting. Now, during this period, you've got various different people, Garrick being one of them, who are changing the way that acting takes place. And the descriptions of it are they're very familiar to our ears, because what they do is they remind us of the style of acting very much that we have now. However, there's a word of caution that you should have on that, and that is that despite the fact it says it was naturalistic acting and they talked about the science of acting, it is undoubtedly, to our eyes, if we were to go back in time and watch it in the 18th century, we would still find it very much less truthful, Stanislavskian truthful, than the current style of acting in the theatre today. So we've got the fact that Macklin had two major concerns. One of them was diction, so the clarity of the words that were spoken, and the other is the creation of individual characterization. Now that is a departure, that is a move from what was so popular in the 18th century. In the comments about Garrick, we've got that he had fantastic facial expressions, very energetic, very dynamic, and he had what is described as a total physicality. I'm not sure what that means, but if you look at the photographs if you look at the paintings and the line drawings of Garrick, he is portrayed as being very physically animated in his performances. Also, at this particular point, later on in his career, Garrick was referred to as having psychological insight. Now, if you think about that, psychological insight is something that in those days that could not have been made, that comment could not have been made at the time, because there was no such thing as psychology at that particular time. That happened with Freud much later, a century later, with Freud, and also in terms of an overriding or overarching theory, that didn't happen until Stanislavski 100 years later. But looking back in time, with the benefit of hindsight, with the benefit of Freud and Stanislavski, what we can see is that he was doing things that we now recognise to be psychologically insightful. He was trying to get inside the character. Another thing about Macklin from the same period is that he was very interested in acting where there was natural delivery, particularly in the sections of text where no emotion was called for. And that's an interesting point to make, in that obviously when they had moments of high emotion, they would probably have still carried on doing the great big bombastic pieces and been more declamatory. But he was looking at creating a sense of naturalness when the lines were more ordinary and weren't about great dramatic sections in the text. And so it was about naturalness. And the reason we're looking at this, because this is not the century we're writing about, we're looking at how this reveals to us what was going on in Shakespeare's time. Now, we know that at the beginning of the 18th century then we've got this codified language in terms of physicality, so there are certain movements that are there to show you certain emotional states, and as an actor you had to know those and you had to use those. We know that it was a bit static, we know that it was declaimed, we know that characterization was not a focus, we know that the dialogue was very fixed, and it sounds very, very uninteresting. I think it must have been more interesting in all probability than the way it sounds on the page in the Garrick book, because otherwise I can't see why anybody would want to go and see it. There was a certain sense of artificiality about it, so all the movement and stuff, and the reference I gave you yesterday was that to a certain degree it sounds like certain of the movement elements of ballet, classical ballet today. So that was what it was like at the beginning of the 18th century. Towards the end of the 18th century we've got people doing very naturalistic things, or things that sound naturalistic. When did that change happen? In Shakespeare's lifetime, was there no naturalism? This is a question you've got to answer. In Shakespeare's lifetime, was there any sort of psychological insight shown, or did they just learn the lines and say them? Was it the same from the time that Shakespeare wrote them all the way up to the early part of the 18th century? That is where our journey is going. That is what we've got to look at, and that is the information we've got to access.